So thank you all for being here. I'm Ben Castleman. I'm an editor and writer with 538. And we're gathered at an interesting moment. I think interesting is a safe comment. An interesting moment on tax and regulatory policy. In particular, it's been an eventful first 100 days and looks like it's going to be an eventful right up to the end of that 100-day mark. As I'm sure many of you saw on Friday, President Trump signed a number of memorandums and executive orders relating to financial regulation and to tax regulation. And it sounds like this week we may get kind of our first glimpse of at least the broad outlines of a tax plan, although nobody seems too sure on what any of that is going to actually hold. I'm sure we'll get into some of those details over the course of this panel, but I sort of want to set out two questions that I'm hoping will frame this a little bit. The first of those is sort of how likely we are to see fundamental change in either of these areas under this administration and this Congress. Not just sort of one-off tax cuts or rollbacks of loopholes, not just the rollback of a couple of Obama administration regulations, but the kind of fundamental reform that we were promised on the campaign trail and that, frankly, we've been promised by members of both parties in one way or another on campaign trails for the last several cycles. And then secondly, to the extent that we do see change, large or small, does that fit into this sort of traditional framework of, for lack of a better word here, sort of normal Republican reform? Or do we see something different in some way? And whether you want to call that different thing populism or economic nationalism or assign some other word to it. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get into sort of both of those as overarching questions on this. We have a wonderful panel here today to help us wade through those questions and others. Vanessa Williamson at my far left here is a fellow in governance studies here at the Brookings Institution, where she studies public attitudes towards taxation. She previously served as policy director at the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And her new book is titled Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes. She has a doctorate from Harvard. Philip Wallach is senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings, where he has written about regulatory issues, particularly environmental and financial regulation. His recent work examines the legitimacy challenge facing the U.S. administrative state. He holds a PhD from Princeton. And Louise Shiner, to my immediate left, is senior fellow in economic studies and policy director at the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy, again here at the Brookings Institution. She's previously worked at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, at U.S. Treasury Department, the Council of Economic Advisors, and she holds a doctorate in education from Harvard. So thank you all three of you, economics, excuse me. She has an education from Harvard. So Louise, I wanted to start with you. Tax reform, and especially corporate tax reform, seems to be one of these things that everybody agrees is necessary from both sides of the aisle, and yet it never happens. According to our Treasury Secretary, it's a lot simpler than healthcare reform, but the evidence on that is outstanding, I guess. So I'm curious sort of why this is so difficult, and to the extent that there may be a path towards some kind of agreement, what that might actually look like.
Yeah, so I mean, tax reform sounds easy until you start looking at the details, and then it gets difficult, just like health reform. It is quite different, I agree with you, than health reform, where at least the diagnosis of the problem is commonly shared, right? So the U.S. corporate tax is the highest among the OECD partners. We have a tax system that supposedly taxes worldwide income, but allows for a ton of income not being taxed or being taxed at much lower rates because there are loopholes, because of gimmicks. And so I think everybody agrees that it's a problem. And then in particular, we also worry that our tax system is pushing U.S. companies to move headquarters overseas to become foreign companies. So we agree on the problem. And the Obama administration had a corporate tax proposal. So that's different than health reform, where we don't even agree on the basic facts on the ground. But then when you try to think about where do you go from here, it becomes very difficult. And I think three basic reasons. So if you think about tax reform, what people often mean about tax reform is not just a tax cut, but really, as you say, a sort of essential change in how we tax. So the House Republicans have a proposal that I would call real tax reform, where you're really, really changing the way corporate and business income is taxed, where it's going to depend on where the products are sold rather than where they're produced. So it's very, very different. If you want to have a tax reform that isn't just a tax cut, but that is revenue neutral, right? That says we're going to lower taxes in some areas, we're going to have to raise them in other. We're going to get rid of loopholes. We're going to get rid of the gimmicks. Then what happens is you split the business community, right? There are winners and there are losers. And once you've done that, it makes it very, very difficult to pass, right? So so take an example. In the House Republican tax reform plan, they have this border adjusted tax, this BAT you've probably heard about, right? And what that appears to do, economists would argue that it doesn't, but what that appears to do is to tax importers and subsidize exporters. So a retailer like Walmart that imports most of its stuff is firmly against it. So and it will also, not only are they against it in terms of saying this is bad for our business, but they say it's going to raise prices on consumers, right? So a congressman and a lot of their voters shop at Walmart is going to have a hard time voting for that. So because there are winners and losers, it just makes it very, very difficult for everybody to get on board, right? So that makes it hard. So, but it's not as hard if you say, you know what, we don't have to be revenue neutral. We can make some of these reforms and, let it pass through and increase the deficit. Well, that becomes difficult for other reasons. So certainly at this point in time, with the debt already very high, there are people in the Republican Congress who would not easily vote for something that increased deficits. Procedurally, it's difficult as well because in the Senate, if something increases deficits beyond the 10-year window, you have to have 60 votes unless they change those rules, which would mean that you couldn't do it just with Republicans, so that becomes difficult. And I think on top of that, at this point in the business cycle, it's a lot harder to argue that we need to cut taxes in order to spur the economy, right? So we're kind of at full employment. The Fed is raising interest rates. You kind of lose that argument. So it's easier to get those kinds of tax cuts when everybody says, well, we need to do something, right? And then I think the third reason that it's hard, as we said, both Republicans and Democrats want to do something, but cutting business taxes, corporate taxes, individual business taxes, tends to be distributionally tilted towards the wealthy. Right? So the only way the Democrats would sign on is if you had something that really had a lot of benefits, a lot of, it doesn't have to be taxes, but it could be taxes or ACA subsidies or for the people in the middle and lower income classes. It's not clear to me that the Republicans would give enough to make the Democrats want to do that, especially because we've got 2018 on the horizon and people said, well, you know what, if we just wait, maybe, this will be a do-nothing Congress and we could take over the House. So I think for those reasons, it just makes it incredibly difficult.
Vanessa, one of the things that you have written is that one of the obstacles to reform is that Americans hold some pretty fundamental misunderstandings of how our tax system even works. So I'm curious what some of those misconceptions are and how that affects this tax debate.
Yeah, great question. So I think it's important to start by saying that, because tax policy is very complicated, it's common for smart and educated and even very politically engaged people to hold misconceptions about tax reform, right? So I think that it's important to sort of recognize that that's a problem that's not just limited to certain kinds of people. But right, it's true that Americans do hold these really fundamental misunderstandings. One of them, well, a lot of them are on the individual tax side, but the distinction in the average person's mind between the individual income tax and the corporate income tax is not very strong. People tend to group together corporations and the wealthy as people who don't pay their share. And whether you believe that or not, if they don't pay their share, it's not for the same reasons, right? It's a completely separate code. So you have to sort of recognize that people know very, very little about corporate taxation in general. The only piece of it that I think is widely understood, or at least widely even, that people are even aware of, is the idea that some companies are hiding their money overseas. But of course, the details of a policy that would address that and which kind of policy would address that in a way that aligns with any given voter's values is extremely difficult to say, right? I mean, even experts disagree on these subjects. The other piece of sort of public misconception that I think may play a real role this year is a tendency for people to perceive loopholes and not rates as the thing that really matters for public opinion or for the tax rate that you pay. So, for instance, people often misunderstand a plan that closes loopholes but lowers rates as something that's going to end up revenue neutral, when in fact, obviously you can close some loopholes and lower the rates and end up costing a lot of money, right? Blowing a big hole in the budget, and many of those plans that gets proposed do that. So I think that people tend to misperceive what kind of policies will implement their values. And that, I think, is especially true when they're trying to understand tax policies that don't affect most Americans at all in any immediate way, in any direct way, so that they're really operating with the best information they can get from their very polarized news sources, right? So you face a big partisan divide on that.
A lot more we can get onto on tax, but I want to shift to regulation for one second to Philip here, because unlike with tax where it's been all talk so far, on regulation we've actually seen some stuff happen. We've seen a number of regulations get rolled back through the Congressional Review Act. We've seen this new policy of one in, two out that the president signed as one of his first acts in office. We've seen a number of other Obama-era regulations either suspended or under review. So I'm sort of curious, just take us through the first 100 days. How much action has there been, and kind of what does that tell us about the regulatory approach of this administration going forward?
Well, the first thing to mention is the Congressional Review Act that you noted. So that has a time-limited window, 60 legislative days since a rule was finalized. So that leaves a lot of Obama administration rules that were vulnerable to having Congress pass this procedurally advantaged disapproval resolution, and then the president has signed those. So 13 rules from the Obama administration have been wiped off the books through that mechanism so far, and the White House even sort of had a press briefing saying, hey, everybody, take note of this. This is a big deal. Only one rule had ever been wiped off the books in this way before, and we've done it more than a dozen times now. So those don't tend to have been really big blockbuster rules, though, because the Obama administration sort of sheltered its most important rules by getting them passed earlier. On a lot of those fronts, there's a lot of important stuff that the Obama administration did through executive orders or guidance documents, and the Trump administration is able to just, with their pen and their phone, wipe those out, and have done so on quite a lot of things. For other ones, such as the Clean Power Plan, which one of the regulations that was the most controversial that I study, we've seen the Trump administration take a somewhat more cautious approach. They put out an executive order saying, we're going to reassess this rule, and they're going to observe all of the niceties of the Administrative Procedure Act in going through and reconsidering that. There'll be a notice and comment process, and we have a pretty good idea where they're going to end up, but they're going to be legally careful about that. So in a lot of those ways, we've sort of seen the opening moves rather than everything. So then the question is, on the bigger picture stuff, reshaping the way regulations get made. So the Trump administration has put in place this one in, two out rule by executive order, but it's really hard to understand exactly what that's going to do still. The rule says, the executive order says, this should not be interpreted as being inconsistent with any statutory requirements. So that means, presumably, any rule that is mandated by statute cannot be wiped off just because this policy is in place. So we're going to have to see how OMB Director Mulvaney and the nominee for the head of OIRA, Naomi Rao, figure out what to do with that exactly. And likewise with the regulatory budget, that's also a part of that same executive order, where the administration says they're going to aspire to zero net costs for all of the regulations that they are going to implement. So that's on the executive branch side. What can they do themselves? We have to see how that'll all work out. Then we have the congressional side, and really I think a lot of this stuff on regulation is of greater interest to Congress than it is to the White House in some ways. And so Congress has endured 8 years of the Obama administration where they felt, or at least 6 years with the Republican majority in the House, where they felt very marginalized, and they've been passing reforms through the House for many years now that would really significantly restructure the regulatory process. And so they've now passed some of those same ones through the House again. the real action is in the Senate, where it's not clear if you can count up to 60 votes on some of those. You might be able to, or what you could work through reconciliation somehow. But that's where the real action is going to be this upcoming summer, I'd say.
I'm curious just to delve down on that slightly, and I'd love Louise and Vanessa to weigh in on this as well. We've seen a sort of flurry of undoing right in the beginning of this administration, and we know that the Obama administration relied heavily on executive action, especially in the last 6 years. Now we're sort of seeing the fundamental impermanence of that on some level. But the early days of the Trump administration have also been very focused on executive action. We obviously haven't seen anything really in the way of legislation. Are we heading towards a place where there's just much more sort of back and forth every time there's a change of control versus a little bit more of the permanence that we might have been used to some degree on the regulatory side?
I mean, you're sort of talking from my book as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the way that the Constitution sets up our policymaking process, really to achieve any degree of stability, it needs to go through Congress and congressional enactment of statutes. And the more that becomes something that administrations in the White House try to do without and circumvent, the more that we set ourselves up for a regime of policy instability where there's reversals after reversals and really very little policy certainty, which is obviously very economically destabilizing.
I mean, I think that comes from the polarization that we've seen, that it's not because they don't want to use the congressional process, but that's such a broken process that there's so much disagreement. Trying to get 60 votes for anything in this administration is going to be very difficult. And so, and it was in the last administration as well. So, I think that, so I totally agree that we will see more of that, and that's because that's kind of all they have at their disposal that they can actually easily get done. So,
yeah, just to follow up on that, I think it's one troubling aspect of it is that I think it has a little bit of a self-reinforcing mechanism where because if you're in the administration you can't get what you want done through Congress, then you're obliged to use executive orders, but then you take very polarized positions, right? And that sort of reinforces a sort of zero-sum game for the next iteration as well. So you end up with, I don't see how to bring that back in the more traditional governance direction as opposed to it sort of spiraling outward into increased polarization.
Well, I kind of framed this conversation at the outset by saying how likely are we to see fundamental change versus sort of smaller pieces. And I'm curious to sort of set a benchmark here. If we can go down the line and assign a probability, we will then hold you to that, absolutely, because we like holding people to probabilities at 538. But try to just lay out a probability of sort of major reform in either of these areas. We'll just go down the line quickly.
Okay, so on tax reform, I think a really major reform is unlikely. I'm going to give it, and I think the BAT's got maybe a less than 5% chance of something a little bit bigger, still very, very unlikely. I think the probability that they get something, a tax cut, I mean, again, you have Republican administration, Republican control both houses of the Senate, could not deliver. I don't think they will be able to deliver on the ACA repeal. The desire to pass something to bring home to the constituents, I think, will be large. So I think I would give some kind of corporate tax cut, maybe sunsetting after 10 years, whatever, 60% chance and like 35% of nothing much happening.
I like it. All right.
I think Republicans will be able to get on the same page about something again in regulatory process reform. So I think there will be a big law passed, possibly as soon as later this year. The one that has the most traction right now is the Regulatory Accountability Act. I wouldn't want to bet on particular horses, but yeah, I think there's a 75% chance they'll be able to come together on something. I do think there's a lot of other areas where they may end up in conflict and find out that their consensus isn't so deep.
Yeah, I have to admit, I basically just agree with Louise. By far, I think the most likely scenario is a substantial tax cut that is not tax reform. I think that's by far the most likely thing, and I think you're absolutely right that it's not likely to end up being revenue neutral. It's likely to sunset instead.
So if we're not likely to see kind of the big whack at tax reform, Vanessa, maybe start with you. What are we likely to see? What kinds of cuts are we likely to actually see?
Yeah,
cuts or loophole closings, whatever.
Well, so one interesting question is what's going to happen about the tax cuts that were supposed to be in the ACA repeal.
Right.
So that's one thing that I think I would have thought was quite likely a couple of months ago, once the election was completed, that was something you were likely to see change on tax. And now I think that's much less clear. I think they'll probably want to do something about the money that's overseas and bringing that back at some preferential rate. Other than that, I don't think that it's clear at all. I think the sort of big pieces of reform are pretty unlikely, particularly the ones that raise taxes or divide the business community. I think that's exactly the pieces that are at the bottom of the list for me.
Other smaller things either of you think are likely?
No, so again, I'm going to basically agree with Vanessa. What I'm not sure about is whether or not they're going to end up doing, if they do something at all, whether or not they're going to have an individual tax reform and corporate at the same time, or they're just going to do some lowering the rates on corporate, doing something like bringing back, having a repatriation holiday, maybe, some minor chipping at the edges of certain things. Although, so one of the things that I might have thought they would do would be trying to do some things to limit interest deductibility, which is one of the gimmicks that corporations use to move profits overseas. One of the rules that they just decided that they were going to oversee is what the Treasury Department had already issued in trying to do that. So it's really unclear. And I mean, it's really unclear because what you're hearing from the White House and Treasury, you don't even know who's in charge. I mean, so what we're going to hear on Wednesday, I mean, does it matter? Is it really what they've thought? There's no sense, again, I was listening to the previous panel, this idea of having sort of fundamental values from this administration. We don't really know what their fundamental values are and what they want to do or why. So I don't know. No, I don't have anything else.
Just to briefly follow up on that, I mean, yeah, a lot of this depends on how unified does the Republican caucus turn out to be on any of this stuff. Trump had the potential to really bring in some disruptive ideas, whether those end up just getting spat out such that we're sort of back in a world that Paul Ryan circa 2014 would be at home in, or whether the Republican coalition is in a position of having to digest some kind of more fundamental tensions now.
The inversion speech, which I think you're referring to from Friday, is sort of striking as something that President Trump spoke about on the campaign trail. It's something that seemed to sort of fit into his populist agenda to go against this, and then we obviously saw him go sort of totally the other direction on Friday. I mean, what should we make of?
So, I mean, I think this idea of going totally in the other direction is a common theme you might have for this administration. And if you think about the people they've put in place to do economic policies, as opposed to other, agencies, EPA or Justice or something, are really people who would be comfortable in Paul Ryan's world, right? I mean, there are people from Goldman Sachs, there are people who are in sync with the business community, except for Peter Navarro, but who seems to have been kind of sidelined. And so I don't think that Trump cares enough about the details or really wants to understand the details that sort of what he said on the campaign trail, necessarily matters that much. So I think if we see anything, it'll be much more like Paul Ryan style tax change, I think, than something kind of really different. And I think that's more true on economic policy than perhaps on other policies.
Although the one thing that Paul Ryan sort of really explicitly wanted on tax reform is border adjusted taxes. It looks like he's not going to get that.
Right. So I don't mean what Paul Ryan himself wants, because I think he's not going to get that, but sort of what a standard Republican plan might be, which is what you sort of start off with, which would be let's lower taxes on investment, let's lower taxes on business, I think is what you're going to find, and not this let's make sure that corporations have to pay if they want to leave, the stuff that was on the campaign, right. The stuff that when it gets proposed or even talked about, they'll say, oh, that's going to be terrible for business and that's going to be terrible for, investment, and I think it gets dropped. But.
Is that true on the regulatory side as well, Philip, that we're...
So I do think there are a lot of potential institutional conflicts between Congress and the executive branch in any political environment, and that's certainly true here. But I do think that this is one of the easier issues for Republicans to hold hands and get along on. I think there's a possibility that there will be blowback at some point, that sort of people will say, hey, Trump, you're just serving business interests after all this populist rhetoric. What gives with that? But I do think that for now, there's this harmonization. Well, we have to allow U.S. businesses to thrive and get rid of these regulatory barriers, and that's the way of promoting U.S. jobs. And that sort of rolls into a fairly coherent narrative that they can run with for a while.
Curious on both of these sets of issues, how true you think that assumption is, that there are, the existing tax and regulatory structure are holding back the U.S. economy in sort of a fundamental way, and to the extent that it is, sort of what areas you see as the biggest tension points there. Philip, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I have some sympathy. I mean, it's very hard to assess quantitatively or counterfactually. You know, what would the world be like with a whole lot less federal regulation? But I do have the sense that we have this layers and layers of accreted regulations that really do create some serious barriers. We have a lot of regulations that are not very discriminating in whether they apply to very small businesses versus big businesses. Certainly in community banking is one that gets a lot of emphasis. And so I think there should be kind of like a bipartisan space for doing some regulatory pruning that would be very productive for helping the U.S. economy. Of course, everything is so polarized. It's always hard to find that bipartisan space, but yeah, I think there's some real truth to it. And so when Trump reaches for some of these things that do seem kind of gimmicky, like the 1 in, 2 out kind of thing, I have some kind of sympathy for saying, well, you just need to create some kind of forcing mechanism where we say we're going to force bureaucrats to go in and reckon with what the existing laws on the books are doing and whether those are really cost effective. Because a lot of times we just do cost benefit analysis when we put regulations in place, and we don't really return to them all that much later. So there's a lot of crudeness in that 2-for-1 approach, but it does seem like doing something to try to confront the regulatory burden makes sense.
Louise?
Yes, so I basically agree with that, and I think that you know, if we're looking for something that's going to be, oh, we just do this, and then we're going to have so much growth, we're going to have so many jobs. Like, there's no silver bullet like that. And so this idea that that every reg, that if a reg's costs are greater than its benefits, we should get rid of it, and we should have a process that thinks about that. I think that's right. Would I go there first if I said, what would you, if you could make changes, is that where you would focus? I wouldn't. And again, on the corporate taxes, I think it is a problem. It will need to be addressed at some point. But I also don't think it's going to be like, if we get rid of corporate taxes, we're going to have this huge increase in investment and a huge increase in jobs. I wouldn't go there. When I think about where I would go to areas where, my view is that the biggest problem that we have is rising inequality, which I think also contributes to potentially slower productivity growth, and I would go to things that address that. I would go to things like make sure we invest in poor kids, make sure they don't have lead in their water. These are obvious ones that I think are more important, that aren't getting the attention. I would think about antitrust, because I think there's some idea that maybe the productivity slowdown might be related to this increased concentration. And then I would think about things that I don't know how much the federal government has in terms of regulation, but I think there is some evidence that sort of the reduction in geographic mobility. It's very hard for people to move to cities where there is productivity, where there is growth, because of zoning issues that makes housing too expensive. I don't know if there's a way for that, and that's increased potentially regulation. And I don't know if there's a way for the federal government to have a role there, but those places I would look. I wouldn't really look to these issues as much. But again, you want to do things that make sense, and everything at the margin can help. So,
yeah, I would just definitely second your point about the sort of challenge of monopoly or relatively few actors in markets. Obviously, that is not the best approach to encourage competition and investment and all these things. I think that we have that issue in a lot of sectors now. I also think that this is not something that's particularly likely to happen in the near future, but I think that one challenge we also face is that with lower tax rates at the top, it encourages it encourages certain kinds of rent seeking, basically, among executives, so that they're less interested in investing in their companies and more interested in providing bigger dividends to their stockholders. So. Their shareholders. So I think that's those are a couple of challenges where I think that there's probably room for regulation that is not particularly likely to happen in the near future, but I think it could be an important part of building an economy that was growing for more people.
One thing that's kind of amazing to me here is the way that we glossed over this revenue neutrality thing. I think if we'd been having this conversation a few years ago, we would not have just sort of, especially with a Republican Congress and a Republican president, we would not have just sort of said, oh, and I don't think it's going to be budget neutral. Although we saw during the campaign, of course, that sort of the deficit was hardly something that came up during the last campaign. I'm curious sort of how we got to that place and how that changes this debate as opposed to if we were sort of insisting on that in a way that we have historically. Louise, maybe you can...
Well, so I think if we were insisting on revenue neutrality, we, would be even more likely not to do anything because it's not, as I said, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to have some people be losers when other people are winners, right? So I think that, there's a question. I think one of the big unknowns in terms of whether or not the Republicans can act unified is whether the people who've been claiming that they care about the debt actually do. When the trade-off is, tax cuts. And I don't think we know the answer to that. I mean, I think that probably they don't care as much as they've said that it was a good talking point when they didn't like what was being proposed. And now when they do like what's being proposed, then it's not as important. And, you can sort of laugh at that, but it actually makes some sense, too. Like, I personally would be willing to have higher deficits for policies that I think would, help in the future, would invest in kids, would invest, if you really believe that tax cuts are going to spur economic growth, even though, maybe the official scores don't say it, it's not that hard to say, well, I don't want to increase the deficit on things that are not useful, that are not helpful, but are things that are helpful, then it's worth it. So I think it's not hard to see people make that adjustment. And that's what you were hearing last week, from the Treasury Secretary, which is that these tax cuts would pay for themselves. So they're not saying, oh, we don't care about it, but we're saying, really it's going to just get so much growth that these things will pay for themselves. And the other thing I think is that we've seen this huge increase in the debt. We've seen this huge reduction in interest rates and projections that interest rates are going to remain low. That in itself, I think, has changed many people's view of how high we can go without, we would have said, oh, with debt this high, you'd expect really high interest rates, and we have the opposite. So I think that's another factor that has changed the conversation as well. I think if you had seen interest rates start to get really high, I think then there would be a lot more on both sides saying we need to get together and do something to lower deficits.
Yeah, I think following up on that point, with interest rates low, there is not a constituency that cares about the deficit meaningfully, right? I think whoever's out of power cares about the deficit because they oppose whatever spending or tax version expenditure you want to put in place, but there's not actually a large community of Americans who care deeply about our deficit, I think, at least certainly not as a primary issue.
In this building, that's the...
Yes.
and one down the street.
Every single one of them is in this room right now, which gives you a sense of their political power as a voting bloc. But yeah, the other piece on that, of course, is that we saw in the early 2000s a Republican willingness to go with a plan that was just going to sunset in 10 years, right? So I think that legislators right now, if they're going to their most recent recollection of what did major tax change look like, it's not the Reagan reforms at all. That's quite a long time ago, first of all, but it's the Bush tax cuts, right? And so I think that that's probably the model most people are operating with when they're thinking about what tax changes can be or should be.
I just have a couple thoughts on that. I mean, how we've changed since like 2010 to the political situation around fiscal policy. I do think part of it also was Obama came through on his promise not to raise taxes on the middle class, right? So the distance between the two parties on these issues for the average American, I think actually feels less than it used to. And on entitlement reform, they used to be very clearly differentiated. And now with Trump having done what he did in 2016, it's again, just kind of, I find it very confusing, sort of, is there a future for entitlement reform at all? Well, right now it doesn't really look that way. So something would have to change, and probably, it would probably have to be interest rates going way up, like in the 1980s, that then create a coalition for really chopping deficits.
And if I can just jump in on that one more time, I think that's such a brilliant point. The other thing that occurred to me is if you're talking about doing something that addresses the issue of the deficit, is it makes the winners and losers so much more obvious, right? So it makes health or tax reform look more like healthcare reform did, where, okay, you're going to have these people getting these benefits, and these people know they're going to lose something, right? And so I think that's one of the real challenges of it. We're in a system right now where having there be any obvious losers, there's not a lot of trust in the system, or trust that next time around we'll fix for other people what's going on. There's this very zero-sum game approach, and I think you're seeing that on entitlements too.
Since you mentioned healthcare, there's been this debate about whether the failure of healthcare reform, unless it rises again this week, how that affects the tax debate. And there's sort of an argument that it makes it significantly more difficult because they didn't repeal the Obamacare taxes as part of that, and if they want to do so, now they have to do it as part of a tax reform package. I've also seen arguments on the other side saying you could just not repeal the Obamacare taxes. How do you see the failure of healthcare playing out in the tax debate? Louise, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think that people who said it makes it harder is because you had some revenue there. I mean, you had space, right? Yeah. Which is that you were going to cut Medicaid, right, and some other benefits, but mostly cut Medicaid, the growth of Medicaid over time, and that gave you money that you could then use to pay for these repeal of the higher income investment taxes in Obamacare. So that's probably kind of off the table. So the question is, so of course it makes it harder to get a very big tax cut, right? You can't use that money, and so to the extent there's any kind of limit on how much you want to increase the deficit, that's going to make it smaller. I think politically, I think I said before, it almost makes it more likely that they'll get some kind of tax cut just because they lost so obviously on a major campaign promise that I think they need something, and that might make them more likely to find something that they can all agree on. But that's a political argument, and I'm an economist, so what do I know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can imagine the politics of it cutting both ways. On the one hand, there might be a little more interest, politically speaking, in finding something we can all agree on so that we get something done. On the other hand, people might feel that, well, our leadership couldn't get it together on the thing that they'd been saying they were going to do for 7 years, so I got to watch out for me, and I'm not doing much for the party right now. And you could see it going either way, right? But I think that it's certainly not the position that if I were in Congress, this is not the position I'd want my party to be in when I'm trying to make these judgments at all.
Curious to whether any of you see the likelihood of a policy change that moves truly in sort of this more populist direction that we heard on the campaign. Are there any policies you would point to as likely to be put in place that move in that direction?
Well, I do think that the president really does seem to care about this American jobs thing, right? A lot of his personal attention seems to have been devoted to that in these early months. And so I think the question to ask about that is whether it will amount to a big systematic policy with far-reaching consequences, or whether it just tends to be a lot of photo opportunities sort of lined up in a way that allows you to sort of craft a populist rhetoric without necessarily having shifted the fundamentals. So I think right now the latter of those two possibilities seems much more likely to me, but we'll see. And there is always the question of, if the president started really shopping for Democratic allies and putting together a more populist coalition across parties, that sounds hard to fathom in the current moment. But on November 9th, I thought it was not such a crazy thing to think about. So I think that possibility remains out there. If he feels like he's just totally spinning his wheels trying to work with an increasingly internally divided Republican coalition, maybe he'll try to sort of go in a completely new direction.
So I think the health reform debate makes it harder because, Trump showed that he was willing to go against his campaign promises, do things that would hurt his constituencies in terms of raising their premiums, not ensuring that health care, cutting Medicaid. And I think that makes him, first of all, a very untrustworthy, apart from everything else, a very untrustworthy partner for a Democrat to go and decide to go against their party right now and sort of go to this populist, proposal where, I think he's shown that that's just not that important to him fundamentally. And so I think that that's unlikely. But, you never know.
Yeah, I think I basically agree. I think there's likely to be things kind of like the carrier deal, where it's got some photo opportunities attached to it. has a negligible impact systemically speaking, and it works via a large amount of money going to business owners. I think those are elements of that I'd expect to see again.
Vanessa, what? Oh, sorry.
I mean, infrastructure is the big one. That is worth tossing out as the one that people were most eagerly expecting. Could sort of do something with big consequences for American jobs. Could have a real populist emphasis on it. I mean, I think there were some of us who thought that could be priority number one in reshuffling American politics. Today, it's kind of nowhere to be seen, but we'll keep looking out for it.
Vanessa, one of the implications from some of your research, though, has been that loopholes in particular are sort of very high salience to people. People are aware of those in a way that maybe they don't understand marginal tax rates and sort of the tax system more generally. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder about a tax reform that, by repealing a couple of specific sort of unpopular loopholes, is then able to be sold in a way as being populist, even if sort of all of us who are sitting here sort of pointing to the models say that it's not.
Right. I mean, I think that there is this sort of fundamental challenge in terms of people being able to assess tax reform as it's happening, because there's such an interest in, among politicians to present their plans in the best possible light, and the media people receive on these issues is so polarized. I think it's very hard for people to actually get accurate information. There's some good research on the Bush-era tax cuts suggesting that people really had fundamentally misunderstood a lot of those policies. I think you're absolutely right that it's likely that closing a few loopholes, drawing attention to a few loopholes, could become sort of the major story that overrides the sort of systemic application or implications of a tax package. But I think, fundamentally there's this huge gap between what public opinion would suggest would be the popular policies and what policies actually get implemented, right? And that's not just true in tax reform, that's true across the board. You were mentioning infrastructure. By far, this is a bipartisanly popular thing with Americans. Americans believe we should be investing in roads and schools and things like that, and bridges and sort of rebuilding our infrastructure. This is something that you get overwhelming, almost consensus level support for in the American public. And at the same time, if you ask what bothers people most about taxes, their top two concerns are that corporations and the wealthy aren't paying their share. Right? So if you were to look at public opinion and guess blindly, naively what our policies were going to look like, you'd imagine a very, very different political moment from the one we're in. Right? So I think that while I think it's crucially important to understand what most people think, I do not think it is the best guide to, unfortunately, to guessing what legislators will do.
I'd actually love to unpack that slightly, and I'd love to get all three of you to weigh in on this quickly. This is selfish on one level because I write about this for the public, but I suspect a lot of people here in one form or another communicate these ideas to the public. If there's if some of your findings are that sort of facts do affect people's opinions on this, how do we do a better job of talking about these issues to a public that is understandably not going to sit here and delve into distribution tables in any kind of deep way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a critically important question for trying to build. If we're talking about building a political system that does not just have this huge uncertainty and polarization, it has to you have to be able to talk to most people. And the problem is that most people don't. Well, the real problem is that most people don't receive their news from Brookings, and they would be getting it right. You know what I mean? But people have sort of self-selected into media that really reinforce what they think. So it's very, very hard to break through the kind of echo chambers that people exist in when it comes to giving people policy information. Now, I think in some places you can really make a difference. One thing that I've found is that talking to people about taxes paid by low-income people, which tend to be forgotten, so things like sales taxes and payroll taxes, which are very expensive for low-income and working people, when people are reminded of those taxes that lower-income people pay, they're much more supportive of government spending on lower-income and working families, right? Because they see those people as chipping in a way that they'd kind of forgotten when we all focus on the top end of the federal income tax, right? So I think there are places for that, but then there are also places where facts, kind of bounce off, right? And unfortunately, one of those places tends to be, for instance, attitudes about immigration and immigrants, right? So it's widely believed that immigrants don't pay taxes and undocumented immigrants aren't doing their share. And of course, actually, undocumented immigrants are propping up Social Security and Medicare because they're paying in money that they don't currently have the right to receive, right? So I think that on some issues you can make headway, but sometimes you're hitting up against sort of symbolic attitudes and very deeply held stereotypes, and that I think that's a place where just bringing some facts and a pie chart to the table are not going to get the job done, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you have a hard job, right? Because there's a lot of research recently, you're reading about it, how the facts can backfire, right? That just keep on explaining how people are wrong and that they're not thinking about something right, just hardens their position, And I think what Vanessa said, though, I think is to the extent, people say, how do you communicate? If you can tell a story, right? You can personalize, humanize. That is a way of getting through where people aren't going through, trying to do the math, because you're not going to win on that. But people are just feeling, some kind of kinship, right? And that I think has the possibility. But I think it's a hugely difficult problem, especially with the polarization of the media sources. So, but what will be interesting is to see if there is a tax plan that starts to come out, is how, Fox News will talk about it. And I don't know what the answer to that will be, right? And I think that will matter.
We have some time for questions from the audience. I think there are folks with microphones walking around. Let's start here in the front.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. We have a president who, as a candidate, when asked about releasing his tax returns and the prospect that he paid no taxes, was said paying taxes is for losers, and he was proud of it. So although your work, Ms. Williamson, suggested that there's a civic responsibility that Americans have, in fact, our president is the poster child for not feeling that sense of civic responsibility. So even with that, and I'm getting into a question, even though something like 55% of the people say they'd like to see his tax returns, it appears to be mostly like prurient interest, because 95% of the people who voted for him say they will vote for him again, and 15% of the people who voted for Hillary Clinton say they wouldn't vote for her again. So my question is it acceptable that the rich actually don't pay taxes? Because that's actually what he stands for. So don't you all have to flip the coin and accept the fact that people will, in fact, support rich people not paying taxes?
Vanessa, let's start with you. I'm interested in one piece of that especially, right, which is this sort of faith in the American tax system if we have a president who was able to game the system to some degree, and also, of course, where we don't have many details on it.
He supported it. He won gaming the system.
So I think that there are a couple interesting things here. First of all, it's important to recognize that rhetoric from Donald Trump is genuinely quite different from the traditional Republican rhetoric, elite rhetoric about taxes. Yes, certainly it has been the standing position of the Republican Party that taxes should go down and that taxes are sort of bad, and holding an anti-tax position is the position to hold to be a Republican. Yes, that was always different from demonstrating that you'd paid your own taxes. And you can remember, just looking back to Mitt Romney, who made a very big point. He'd always paid 13%, at least 13%. And that was what he said over and over again as he was, his tax returns were coming out or had just come out. Anyway, the point he wanted to make was that he had at least paid this much. And that was what he stood on. So it's actually a really striking change, and sort of demonstrates one of the ways in which Trump's public rhetoric really does differ from the Republican standard position. So I'm interested to see. So the American consensus that paying your taxes is a civic duty is something that has held steady for 40 years. Polls on taxes tend to be done in April, which means that those polls are just coming out now. And I'm very interested to see whether you see a switch on the Republican side. It has traditionally been the case that Republicans are more likely than Democrats to describe tax paying as a moral obligation. It would be interesting to see whether that changes this year. But the level of public commitment to that has been so very high. I mean, we're talking 80 or 90% agreement, that even if there is a partisan divide, I'd expect it's relatively small. On the sort of politics of it, I had expected that one of the sort of unifying phrases that Democrats would use to simply oppose tax reform from the Republicans' whole stop was this question of whether any tax reform would benefit the Trump administration, right? And I think we've begun to see some of that rhetoric coming out of Schumer's office. So I think that it does actually make for a slightly different set of political dynamics, this particular question.
So I see it a bit differently than the questioner's framing does. you know, I see this as sort of part of the cult of the entrepreneur that Donald Trump has promoted about himself, to say that I'm not just a normal person, I'm a dynamic business person of the kind that really makes the economy go. And his position was not that taxes are for losers, but that his own dynamic efforts were so complicated and generated so many things that he was able to legally not pay taxes. He certainly never portrayed himself as a tax evader who had somehow broken the law. But he had of course served his own interests as this dynamic businessman, because he assumes that you, like him, believe that such entrepreneurs really are what make America great and need to be given free rein. So I think, you know, that is something the Republicans have. I think that's been a part of the Republican mindset for a while. I agree with Trump. That's all the focus and sort of normal patriotic duty of regular people to pay taxes doesn't get any recognition at all. But I do see it as something that, you know, and I think the American electorate who put Trump in the White House obviously just accepted his view of himself to at least enough to vote him into office. So I think it doesn't necessarily mean that they've totally shifted their views on what's normal conduct for your normal average Joe.
Another question here? In the back here? You, sir?
Thank you. I was wondering if y'all could talk about the future for financial regulations, particularly given the difficulty pinning down costs when doing traditional benefit cost analyses on them, as well as the recent guidelines on the 2-for-1 rule, focusing on costs as the major indicator, and the administration's kind of general attitude towards financial regulations. Thank you.
Bill?
So, I mean, obviously Dodd-Frank is a big target. The Republican rhetoric on Dodd-Frank has always been it's 100% bad, which, given it's such a complex law with so many moving parts, has always been a little confusing to me. I don't think there's a lot of potential for actual whole-scale Dodd-Frank repeal, but I do think there's a lot of sections of it that look vulnerable and that you could possibly count up to 60 votes on. You know, giving regulatory relief to community banks would certainly be one of those. Maybe the Volcker rule would be another. So there are areas where I think some kind of legislative change is likely. In terms of your other question about 2-for-1, I think it gets right at the point. I don't think it's actually so unique to financial regulation. I mean, in a lot of areas of regulation, understanding exactly what the costs and benefits of a rule in place are, it's very difficult. The guidance that the White House has put out to this point says that you should not just use cost-benefit analyses made at the time of promulgation of the rule. So it's really a big looming question of how the OMB would go about doing these cost exercises. I don't have answers yet, so that's one of the big question marks on that policy.
Back here?
Thank you. I'm Jordan Seltz. I'm a student at Howard University, and my question is exactly about taxation without representation. So there's a campaign that was started, Occupy Wall Street or whatever. In previous administrations, they've had to deal with that same campaign. How is that going to play into this current administration?
Please.
I don't think that it's likely to be more successful in this administration than in previous. I think previous administrations, I think it's less likely to be something that people care about. DC is a Democratic district, so I don't see much action on that there.
Yeah, I think that you know, I think there is a lot of public concern about Wall Street and about the sort of power of the wealthy over our political system. And I think there's more of that now in this current administration. I think we've seen a real striking uptick in sort of popular mobilization on the left. I think the question looking forward is whether that energy gets channeled into for instance, electoral success or other forms of organizing that have sustainability. And I think that is an open question. I don't think it's at all resolved yet. But I think one of the important, perhaps the most obvious takeaway from the last election is having more people on your side does not mean that you win, right? And when it comes to political mobilization, that's absolutely the case, right? So I think that one of the most interesting things that, as a political scientist, I'm interested in watching over the next 4 years is whether the very widespread and initial response to the Trump administration in terms of popular opposition becomes a sustainable movement that actually results in political power.
Hi, I'm Laura Saarikoski, a reporter from a Finnish newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat. I have a more general question about the future of the United States. I've been traveling to 48 states now and talking to people from all political sides, and I'm really worried about the future of the United States. That is, I'm wondering whether there exists anymore any kind of a discussion or dialogue between, for example, you and your more conservative colleagues. Because, I go to these events and I listen to the Democratic side, I listen to the Republican side, and both sort of talk only to each other. And now when Trump is in the White House and he's not a traditional conservative, I was wondering if there would be more room maybe for some kind of a dialogue between, let's put it this way, the establishment or the elite of both parties and the think tanks, because you could actually reach a little bit more of a common ground since the president is not only from another party. How do you see the sort of the future of the political debate on tax issue, but also on other political issues in the U.S.?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we don't talk to other people. In fact, Kevin Hassett has just been named the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. He works next door, and we talk to Kevin all the time. And I used to work with Kevin at the Fed. So I think among sort of the among economists and stuff, there is debate. But as we said, the kind of conversations that we have are really very different from the conversations that are in the political sphere. We talk about whether or not the exchange rate is going to adjust to the border. We talk about technical stuff, and of course we have no problem talking to each other that way. So I think you get back to this question that we had before, which is, how do our discussions matter for the politics? Is there a way that common ground that economists might have or political scientists might have can somehow translate into common ground, among voters? And, I think we're all kind of stymied on that question, frankly. It's very hard to know when the kind of discussions we have don't seem to matter for voters.
And on that note of certitude and optimism, we will end things. We're out of time. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to our panel.